I'd like to thank him and Juliana for the invitation. What's the main goal or aim of today's talk? It's something you already mentioned the title of the presentation, but there is also a sub-title, some conservative approach. Why I would like to start with this. There are two reasons. First reason is that I think that even in the field of so-called social ontology, we are still working on the same way as it has been in the so-called old-fashioned ontology or old-fashioned metaphysics. And the second reason is that we do realize that some entities, some facts, some processes which are named by social entities, social facts, social processes are somehow dependent on us, on humans. So, but nevertheless, as we have perhaps in philosophy of mind such kind of approach, it is not necessary, as Slobodan at the morning explained us, it is not necessary reductionism. It could be other way around. And I'm just trying to explain something in this way or in this direction. Why I just choose the quotation from the Plato, or the first quotation, because there are some more. Because I think that in Plato we find the main clue what is going on in the ontology. Whatever the ontology itself is, or in the which field of ontology are we working, the basic idea is more or less here. So what we are trying, as Plato said, we are trying to come closer to the real structure of, and you can imagine what can fulfill this then after. Okay, he's speaking here about the numbers and so on, but nevertheless, the idea is so. The next point is that we are trying to come closer and closer to the real structure. Then, when we are coming closer and closer, we somehow collect entities which are supposedly, at least, there. So we introduce something like categories. Whatever such categories are, it is at this point not important what these categories are. So there's just a little bit more exegetical explanation of what is going on in previous quotation, but nevertheless, what we are trying to get is real structure, so-called real entities, and categories of real entities. So there is a division between categories and division in the category between different entities. As Plato himself said, we are trying to collect this plurality under one label, one category, or whatever. So he's always nicely explained, he was trying nicely to explain what are we doing when we collecting, when we are dividing, when we are describing. That's his idea. So we have the first clue, real structure. The second clue, real entities. The third clue, categories. The fourth clue, a proper definition of three of them. That's the basic idea. I'm sure that if we are looking now to the today's approaches in ontology, the same strategy is applied. So, and nevertheless, the last clue is the idea of what Plato himself described as the law of nature. In the plural, laws of nature. Why? Because if we have a real structure, if we have real entities, if we can somehow connect them according to the categories, there has to be relation between either categories or between entities in different categories. And such relations could be either formal or, as Plato would say, it is based on the resemblance, or there is something like a law or laws of nature which somehow connect such entities. What is important, the next message from Plato, that this resemblance, which is somehow formal, or formal relations between entities, has to be also real relation. It couldn't be the case that it is just our way of describing something. Because, for instance, Slobodan used this description of two bottles with different colors, and you know, the description of colors is something that is imposed on the real object, because somehow if you go to the physics, we would get an explanation. What does it mean? What is the real property of this or another bottle, in the sense of color? So that's, and then the next point is, and all of these clues you can find directly in Plato himself. So the additional point is so-called modified Eleatic Stranger's argument from Sophist, where the idea of causality as an important sign of being real in the world is introduced. So I'm not using the whole quotation, I'm just somehow rearrange, not really rearrange, but adjust to my purpose. It is the idea that you can take in your ontology just an entity which has a causal property. It could be active, could be passive, doesn't matter. And vice versa. If there is no causal law, that is really a good reason not to introduce or include such kind of entity in your ontology. That's the first part of my talk, or what I saying it is so-called very conservative approach. So the second point is that we need some kind of causal theory, or better to say, the explanation of this specific causal relation, or causal necessitation, better to say, which is included in such kind of ontology. So that's just description. I will not try to bother you with this then we can, in discussion, say a little bit about it if you would like to have some. So there is a very brief description of my starting point, or not my starting intention. So if we have an ontology, we would like to have a so-called true description of the world. So if it is really true, or if it is just assumed to be true, or if it could be the case that it is just a false theory or false description, it is another question. But nevertheless, whenever we have such kind of description, and we are not assuming now that it must be true, or it is true, or it is assumed to be true, whatever, we have to introduce, as Plato himself did, a specific conceptual scheme. Why? Specific conceptual scheme is used just for, or better to say, it is our specific tool. How can we approach a real structure of the world, real entities of the world, or real categories of the world? So we can't do it without a proper conceptual structure. So if we are using a predicate logic, it is just a way. How can we formalize something? If we are also introducing such kind of logic, a modality, it is another step. But it depends. You know, if we are looking back to Plato, we see that he is not using, or he was not using, a modality in his description. Perhaps in Aristotle, as Andrea showed us, some kind of modality is already included. So, nevertheless, what we are trying to do is then to find a way how to decide between the conceptual scheme and the real structure. Is there a way out? So are we just not in the conceptual scheme that would somehow define us? Or as I mentioned at the end of, in the appendix to the abstract, it is a problem of how to decide if an experiment can or could help us, because we always introduce. Okay, that's another point. I find Lewis' idea of deciding between theories very useful. I mean, not just about theories, I mean about ontologies, very useful. Here is a quote from his book on plurality of words. So, plurality of words from 1996. His idea is very simple. And it is nothing so new, because it was already used in the Middle Age, then in the 16th century, in the 17th century. Somehow it was then put on the side, but nevertheless. So his description is, you see, there is something like a net utility of ontological hypothesis, and how we can get this. His idea is really simple. Just as we are doing in economy or in cost-benefit analysis, the same way we can do here. The problem is that, what are requirements for this comparison? What is on the side of cost? Sure. What is on the side of benefits?
And what is subtraction also?
Yes, yes, I agree. Yeah. You see, here is a list. I just borrowed idea or some of parts from Dyer's article from 2002, and we just see first. On one side, we have something that is conceptual, metaphysical, semantic, and that's an open problem, an open door for all other things when we introduce other such philosophical benefits. You know, we are just on the slippery slope or something, because if we are introducing other blah, 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 then who knows what really comes at the end. So it could be the case that we decide between two rivals in ontology, just on the other grounds, which are not. It could be something like part of ideology or whatever it is. So, and second part of the list included, you see, as obvious, we already discussed in the first morning session this difference between consistency, coherency. If there is really a difference in the theory, because a majority, I can say just for modern ontologies, would say that there is no big difference between consistency and coherence. So they are just applying in either one or another notion. The question of so-called conceptual and ontological conservativeness, it's a good approach. What does it mean in the ontology, being conservative? It's usually so that some ontologists would say it is almost the same as Occam razor is. But it is not true. It is something that you can get from the philosophy of science. The question is, when you should abandon one theory, what is a necessary and sufficient conditions of such kind of abundance? So the idea of conservativeness is stay with your so-called conceptual scheme if there is really not a good reason to switch to new way or another one. Conceptual ontological economy, it is something that is very close to the open razor, or it is almost open razor. Simplicity of formulation. The idea is borrowed from the philosophy of science or from the science. If there are two competitors for the theory in ontology or in science, there, if everything else is the same, if one is simpler than another, we should choose the simpler one. The last point, you know, if I think that you mentioned Ptolemaic system and Copernican system, if we have a lot of mathematical calculation which was necessary to explain how is something revolving around the other things, and if there is a unified theory which is simpler, but not that it is simpler in the sense that it has less entities or less laws included, but it is in the this so-called mathematical sense simpler. So we can calculate by one law, one procedure, everything around. So but as I said, it is a list. You can agree, you can be against. It's just a possibility. So we are now just on the way to come to the so-called social part of ontology. And I just, as an introduction, I show you a quotation from Richt, a book which is somehow very informative. On one side, he is speaking about general laws of nature, he is speaking about human nature, he is speaking about intentions, purposes, and so on and so on. So all these things which are included in today's discussion about the social ontology, he already mentioned. And he also included something that is, for my point of view, important. It is the idea of causal explanation. So if we remember back when we started with Plato, it is somehow embedded or implemented idea of Plato. It is the same way of causality as I just showed you a list of explanation, then it is another point or another question which can be discussed. So if the first quotation is from Richt books, it has been published, I think, in 1965, 64 something. Yes, there is another quotation from the Searle, perhaps one of the champions now in the social ontology. We can go about him, but nevertheless, what is his position? He's somehow, as Mario tried to show us, he's in the field of so-called liberal naturalists. His idea is, it is just a quotation, it is just from the article which has been published just before this book about the social reality appeared. So it is just when he is working on the book on social reality, he said it. So reality is physical, science concerns this investigation, and he said there is nothing in physical reality that could not be known. Not that we are not knowing it now, it's another question, but in principle there is everything, whatever there is, it could be known. Not by God Almighty or whatever, but you see, he said explicitly, by us, by humans. So we have, there is, as von Bricht said, there is a special field, a field of sociality. It's not the right English, but nevertheless, I hope you understand. And so try to connect it with the idea of so-called liberal naturalism or some kind of physicalism. And there is a simple way of argumentation for it. If ontological questions are concerned with what exists and the nature of those existing, and the very issue of what a social object, I'm just using object in this general sense. It includes also, as you said, entities, processes, events, occurrence. Okay, right? So, what and if there are such objects, it is also a logical question. But the problem is, are we justified in introducing such kind of object in our ontology? That's now the point.
15 minutes.
What?
15 minutes. A lot of time.
Well, I believe it's 15 minutes. Because the entire talk is 3:45. She said sometime to discuss it.
No, the discussion is around 16:05. There's a mistake here.
Okay, you just tell me when.
Yeah.
To stop, tell me stop. Here is my summary of some important points from Searle's account from this book from 1995. As first, he said that social facts, please don't bother about social facts or objects and so on and so on. It is not an important issue. So, maybe created. How? So that we can assign to the existing physical object a specific function. Here is a stone, and we could, perhaps we are the community of so-called future believers, we could decide that this stone is the sign of Almighty. So the stone, which is a physical object, gets something special. So it is the way that we collectively, it could be either there is just one person who could do it, or it is a collective who is doing this, but nevertheless, we are imposing on the existing physical object something additional. So, and the point is that we cannot get from the structure of the physical object or from the relations something like supervenient property which is based on this physical structure and which would play the role as this sacral object is playing in this procedure. Okay, but here is a very brief explication what he is saying about the so-called constitutive rules, rules which constitute a new so-called social object. So X count as Y in certain context C. You know, if you are doing a little bit in philosophy of language, you see this is another way of explanation of what is going on in the speech acts. Nevertheless, his background in the social ontology are speech acts. But I have here some examples just to see what is going on. There are two neighbors, two lands, there is a certain tree, and we can decide, or these neighbors can decide, this, it is the sign of the boundary. it could be described that it is something like a singular rule. It is constitutive rule, but it is singular. It means that it is applicable just to the specific case. It couldn't be used for another, because this specific tree is a specific object to whom these neighbors assign a specific function. Then we have, okay, it's a little bit silly, about what does it mean to have a passport of a certain state. It is a piece of something. It has to be printed. For Slovenian case, you see, there is a factory, but nevertheless. But it is applied to any issue of this so-called passport. So the difference between first and the second is just that the first is so-called singular, the second is universal rule. The problem is what could happen if we do not have at the very beginning already there something like a physical object, because what has been said earlier is that there is a physical object and then there is a certain procedure which assigns to this specific object a specific function. So here is just a proposal made by Amy Thomason that some of constitutive rules are existential rules. That it means that there is something which is, that it could be some kind of problem when I'm using there is something. It is not meaning the existential way now. Then I will say explicitly that it is about the existence. But there is, it is usually in German as gibt. Whatever it is. So, existential rules just are saying that there could be, we could get something new according to this constitutive rule, which is existential. What does it mean? You have here some lists. Law, or corporation, or state, or matrimonial marriage, and so on and so on. Divorce, whatever you like. Now, we are at the point to ask, or to try to answer next question. Are all social entities constructed? So the answer is yes, for sure. Nothing else. But the problem is that it couldn't be the case that in all possible cases we can introduce this procedure. He explicitly said it, so we are with the way to. There is a case which has been mentioned in the last first book. It is about corporations. And he's quoting from the California Code. One or more natural persons, partnership, association, or corporation, domestic form may form a corporation under this division by executing and filling articles of incorporation. The corporate existence, the existence of corporation, begins by the filling of the articles and continues perpetually unless otherwise expressly provided by law or in the articles. So, the problem is that the law itself, on the code itself, says almost nothing. You see, it seems very useful, but when we try to analyze, we realize that it is somehow vacuous. So, what we have a code or we have a law which is, in this case, a collective creation. It could be the case that if we have something like a dictator or whatever, autocratic system, then there could be just one person who is responsible for this. So this is usually in law now. So what could we do out of the case of corporation according to this new idea which is somehow included in the last service books? Here is a proto-definition. We make it the case by declaration that an entity Y exists that has status function in certain circumstances. So we are now on the way to explain what does it mean. But unfortunately, even if the procedure is good one, what he explicitly said or says is that not just corporation, in our case now corporation, but social entities are fictitious entities. You see, here is something like this. But nevertheless, just 2 pages earlier, he said something else. That he said when a corporation is created, its status function accrue to the actual existing people. Whatever it means. On one side, it is a fictitious. On the other side, it is almost as real as existing people or persons are. Okay. There is something to nervous. I will just skip it. I would like, at the end, show you something how in the legal theory the corporation is understood. It is a long quotation, but nevertheless I will just summarize 3 points. As first, it is usually so that the lawyers and lay people are speaking about corporation as entity. It is something existent. As we are speaking about, I don't know, this chair here before me, we are speaking about corporation or corporations. The second point is, so that what we are doing with corporations is that we reified such an object or ontological object. Why is it useful? You see, if, take a case, if Microsoft, I don't like it, but nevertheless, if Microsoft is the case, and Microsoft introduced new system of Windows, I don't know which is now, which will appear, but very soon it will appear. And they could introduce also a kind of rule that if you would like to use the new version, you have to do something whatever it is. And at the same time, they are obliged to the potential users that they will support them for next, I don't know, certain period. But, you know, this obligation, if it is really obliged, could be, but it is not necessary, could be fulfilled. And who is the entitled for fulfillment of such an obligation? If corporation itself is something fictitious, don't expect that the corporation will do it if it is fictitious. So therefore, it is clear why this reification is the case in the legal system. Yeah. I just it's an idea which I find very a proposal from Dejnoška, perhaps you know from the analytic philosophy something, but he's also involved in this legal dispute about the situation of corporation and so on and so on. And for the end, there is it is my way, as Mario said, I could say it's not Dejnoška himself, but Dejnoška style something. So it is my interpretation of his position, but nevertheless, what I think corporations are typical sort of by many people as being the same single object. So the second point is they are phenomenally qualified objects. I would not say that I include now some kind of perception as Andrea is introducing, but nevertheless, there is at least on the phenomenal level something like corporation. The third point is, if it is true, then corporation cannot be, no, they are something, a qualified object, intentional objects. So they are real entities, as many other things we think of and treat as real. Where we make a cut between which is real and which is not, you see from the middle part, then I try to introduce the Lewisian idea of so-called net utility of ontological objects or ontological thing. That's it.
Thank you, Bojan.